So let's start with your name and your age.
My name is Marilyn Lorraine Safon Epstein, and at this present moment, I'm 81 years old.
So you're born in 1934, September, so you're almost going to be 82.
Yes,
Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president when you were born.
yes, and he was.
So you were born in Chelsea to Eva and Ben. Tell us a little bit about the history of Ben's family first.
Okay. My father, Ben, oh, by the way, he was Benny. My brother was Lenny. My grandmother was Jenny. And I was Marilyn. Oh, and my other brother is Kenny.
Right.
So my father was born in Lithuania. And when he came here, he was 9 years old. He came with his father, whose name was Moses Chutnitsky. And Moses and Benny came over and landed in Ellis Island. Benny's mother, whose maiden name was Saponovitz, was already here with 8 of her children. So they came to Ellis Island, and the registrar asked my grandfather what his name was. And he said, Moses Chutnitsky. And the guy could not spell it. So my grandfather took his wife's maiden name, which was Saponovitz. And they spelled it Safenowitz. And they came over and went to Norwich, Connecticut.
Now hold on. So you say your great grandmother, your grandmother, was Safonovitz.
Yes, that was
She
her.
already had 9 kids. So
8 kids.
So-
9 kids, yes.
so Benny's father
Moses.
married a woman with 8 kids
Oh,
already?
no. They were his children, too.
Okay.
But they
But
had
she was already over here.
She was already here, and to tell you the truth, I don't know who sponsored her. But she was able to sponsor her husband and her last child, Benny, to come over.
And how old? He was 9 years old?
He was 9 years old, and he came over. I'm not sure what the name of the ship was. I'll have to find that. But he couldn't speak English. He spoke Yiddish, and they went to Connecticut, and they registered Benny, my father, in public school.
What year was this when he came over?
He was 9 years old, so he was born in 1899, so it had to have been 1908.
1908. And how long was your mother his mother over here before his father and he came?
I never knew that.
Okay, and what about his grandparents? They both were from
No.
Lithuania?
They were still in Lithuania. If they were still alive, I'm not sure. All I know is my father and his father.
Okay, and how long did Benny's mother and father live? Did you know them?
Oh, yeah. I used to sit on my grandfather's lap. He had a big black leather rocker. And we used to sit, and he had a red beard. And I used to pull at his beard. I remember it to this day. But he loved me very much. And you know, both my father and mother's family lived in Norwich, Connecticut. So when I would go to my mother's family, they would call me by my first Hebrew name, which is Miriam, because I was named after a relative of my mother's. I'd go to my father's family up the street, and they would call me by my middle name, Liba, because that's who I was named after, someone in their family. You know, I never knew what my Hebrew name was until I got back to Boston, because each one called me something different. And of course, my family called me by my English name, Marilyn.
So you spent many a time. Now, did your grandfather and grandmother speak English?
No, they did not speak any English. And my grandfather was a shamus, which is in the synagogue, which is the person who opens and closes and cleans and does all of that. That was his job.
So obviously was not making a whole lot of money.
No, no, they were very poor. But they had a house, and it had a big grapevine in the backyard, and most of their children were married already by the time I came along. I was one of the youngest.
So let's talk about Eva's family. So
Eva's family lived down the street in Norwich. She was born in Norwich. My mother was, and she called herself a Connecticut Yankee because she was born in Connecticut, and she, of course, spoke very good English. Her mother did not speak English, Jenny, and her father was Eli. Eli was a policeman in the city of Norwich, and he was killed when he was 41 years old by a horse. The horse kicked him in the head. He was arresting a horse thief.
What year was that?
Well, that I don't know. I know he was 41.
So was Eva a young girl at the time?
Yes, she was a young girl.
So it must have been in the early 1900s.
Yes, she was born in 1902, as she said, and so she might have been 10 or 11 years old.
So, okay. So, and their parents, where were they from?
That I don't know. Oh, my grandmother Jenny was from, and grandfather were both born in Warsaw, Poland.
Okay.
And thank goodness they came over because that's where the pogroms started with Hitler.
Yeah, and what about their parents?
I never met them.
Okay.
But now my grandmother Jenny did not take any welfare from the city of Norwich. She got no money there was no insurance. So with her 8 or 9 children, she would take in piecework. In those days, they used to make overalls, denim overalls, and my grandmother brought them in the house. So the kids all worked at sewing the overalls. And then the thermos bottles began in the city of Norwich. They're still making them these days. And in those days, they had to put beads inside to keep things cold and hot. And so my grandmother brought that into the house also. And that's how she brought up her children, on piecework like that.
So how did Benny and Eva meet?
Okay, Eva's oldest sister, Sadie, fixed them up on a blind date. And they fell in love, and they got engaged.
How old was she?
Well, she got married in 1924, so she must have been 21.
21, and he was how much older than her? Just a few years?
Yes, just about 3 years older.
3 years older. So they got married in around 1924.
They did get married in 1924. In fact, Corey has an engagement picture of them on a tintype. It's a round picture, and they were a very handsome couple.
So they spent how much time in Norwich before they moved?
Well, my father became a citizen of the United States, and then he was a steam fitter, and they got transferred to Boston. So that's when they moved. Probably not very many years after they were married, because my brother Lenny was born in 1926. But let me go back a little bit. They were married, and my father decided that he couldn't have his children grow up with the name Safonovitz, because he couldn't spell it anyway. So he shortened his name to Safon, S-A-F-O-N. And that's what he became a citizen. That's the name, Benjamin Samuel Safon. And that was right before they got married. So my mother was never a Safonovitz either. She became Mrs. Benjamin Safon.
And what was Eva's middle name?
Florence.
Eva Florence Lindemann.
Yes.
married Benjamin
Benjamin,
Samuel Safonovitz,
no,
and they
Benjamin
became
Samuel Safon.
and they became a couple in 1924,
Yes,
and proceeded to move to Chelsea.
yes, but before they moved, they were wonderful dancers, both of them. And they won all kinds of prizes at dance contests. There's a loving cup, and I can't remember which of my children has that. It's from a Valentine's Day dance, and they won first prize. My father was a pretty good dancer. So was my mother.
Well, so they moved to Chelsea,
Hmm.
and in 1926, a young baby boy named Leonard was born.
But they had a baby before that.
Okay.
1 year before that, they had a little girl who died after when she was 8 days old.
Oh, wow.
She had some kind of pneumonia. My mother did not know what, but she was breathing very heavy. And in those days, everybody was born at home, so
What was her name?
I don't know.
You don't know
I'll have
the
to
name.
find that out.
So that's something I did not know. So there was a death of their first child.
Yes, it
after
was.
8 days. Wow.
Yes, yeah, that was very sad.
That is. So
And then Lenny was born, and they lived on Hawthorne Street in Chelsea. And they met Mendel and Gussie Kornitsky, and they became best friends with that couple. And when Lenny was 5 years old, my other brother was born. His name is Kenneth Norman Safon. And then they moved to Chester Avenue in Chelsea, which was right across from a cemetery.
now, did Eva ever work?
She never worked.
She was always a homemaker.
Always a homemaker and never drove a car. She said she was too nervous to drive when automobiles became popular.
So before we go into more about Kenneth, Ben was a steam fitter,
Yes.
and what types of things would he do
He would
in Boston?
he would install heating systems in big buildings. In fact, if you go to Boston and you see the John Hancock building, which is a very tall building, he put the heat in that building. And when my Corey was a little girl, she would say, "There's Grandpa's building."
Now, was he a union man?
Yes, he was a union man, very active in the pipe fitters union. And he had to be a union man or he couldn't have worked. They wouldn't have allowed.
Do you remember any talk of politics growing up?
No, I just remember always talking about the union being important. But my father was also a poker player and a pinochle player. And he would play in the Labor Lyceum. He would play every Saturday. And when my boys were little, he would take them up there and they would watch him play poker. I think that's how they got to like to play poker nowadays.
So what about his English? He never really spoke very good English.
No, but he did speak English after. But when he was in first grade, all the children would make fun of him because he could only speak Yiddish. And he went up to, I think, the third grade, and then he left school. In those days, you didn't have to go to school.
But now he moved to America when he was 9. So
yeah,
so
but
you're
they
saying-
put him right in the first grade.
Oh, at age 9.
Yeah, so he was a big guy in the first grade.
Right.
And they didn't have English as a second language in those days.
Right.
And so he had a hard time. But he did learn to read and write, and he spoke.
How did he learn his trade?
He was able to read and write. He learned that in school, but his English became a lot easier.
No, but how did he learn the trade of steam fitting?
He was an apprentice. You have to be an apprentice for so many years before you get the certificate that you can do the work. And he worked with a lot of asbestos, and in fact he put hot water heaters in our home and always covered them with asbestos, which is nowadays not good.
Yeah. And and we'll talk about his death later on. But so let's take us through Kenneth.
Okay.
He was born 6 years after?
5 years.
5 years
Yeah, he was
after.
born in 1931 on April 22nd, which is my grandson Adam's birthday.
Okay, so Kenny came, and Kenny had trouble with his ears, his hearing.
He had trouble with his speaking.
His speaking.
He stammered, but he was determined to get over it. He was very strong and had trouble with his speech, but my mother would take him to the Leahy Clinic in Boston to get speech therapy, and he worked very, very hard at it. It was hard for him to talk on the telephone as a child, but he did very well in school and went on to college at Bentley Institute and became an accountant and worked with Avis Rent-A-Car and worked at a couple of other places also.
Well, both your brothers and you were very successful, coming from a father who didn't get past the third grade, a mother who certainly didn't go to college, so two very uneducated parents wound up with a pediatrician, an accountant,
No,
and
an
a
obstetrician.
teacher. I'm sorry, an obstetrician, an accountant, and a teacher,
Yep.
all in one family. So
Yeah.
that was 1931. This was in the heart of the Depression, and you came along in 1934, still in the Depression.
Right.
What do you remember, if any, about the times? Your oldest memory. What is your oldest memory?
Well, I do not remember the Depression because my parents told me that when I came, I brought them good luck and that the Depression was ending and my father got a good job and that when I was a baby, everything changed. So I really don't remember the Depression at all.
Now, was Benny out of work during the Depression?
Yeah, and he worked for the government. I think it was called the TVA, the Tennessee Valley. They had work for people that were out of work, and my father would do that. He would stand in line to get a job, and he got work. He was very determined to support his family.
So you were born in 1934 in Chelsea.
Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you that my mother, when my mother found out she was pregnant, she tried very hard not to have me because they couldn't afford it. And she washed the floors and took castor oil and did all kinds of things, but I was determined to come. And I did.
So Lenny is 8 years older.
Yes.
Was 8 years older.
Right.
Kenny is 3 years
3 years
older.
older, right.
So you were the only girl,
Right.
the baby sister. What are your memories of growing up with two older brothers?
Well, they spoiled me, but then when I was about 5, they said that I should not talk so much, and that every time we'd sit down to eat, there I was talking away, and they would yell at me, my brothers, to be quiet. And I said, I'm going to go into my bedroom and I'm going to shut the door and never talk to you again. And they applauded. It was so funny. Oh, one thing I do remember about my family is on Friday night for Shabbat, my mother would light candles and we would have challah and so on. And we also had root beer. That was the only time during the week that we would have soda. And my father would pour us a glass of root beer and he would say, hurry up and drink it. This is the most you have, look. And it was, all foam and foam right up to the top. So we would all drink it and that was it.
And so you'd celebrate, you grew up very religious, as most of the people in Chelsea did.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your recollections of going to shul?
Well, we did go to shul often, and my best holiday was Simchat Torah, which is when you celebrate the beginning and ending of the Torah. And we would carry, this is so funny, we would carry flags to the synagogue and they were paper flags, and on top of the flag was an apple with a candle, and we would light the candles. Now, can you imagine today children walking in the street with a lit candle? Well, we all did it. My friend Selma was with me, and her brother, and my brothers, and we would walk to synagogue carrying the flag with the apple and lit candle.
So you grew up in the 30s. What is your first recollection of hearing anything having to do with Nazi Germany?
Probably not until the end of junior high school in 1949.
Really?
Yeah, they did not talk about it.
Really? So it took that long. It took 15 years
I
for
think
you
so.
to.
I think so.
That
Yeah.
was your earliest recommendation. Now, did Uncle Lenny go and fight in World War II?
Uncle Lenny was in the Navy in World War II, and he was stationed in the Mojave Desert in California in the Navy. He was a mailman, and he was in for 2 years, and then he got out and went on to college. He went to Northeastern University in Boston, and then went to Boston University Medical School. Took him 2 years to get into medical school because there was a quota at that time for Jewish students. And if you were above the quota, you couldn't get in. And finally, he went to MIT and got a master's degree and finally got into medical school. And he became a very prominent obstetrician gynecologist in Boston.
And we'll talk more about that later. So continuing on in your childhood, you're in Chelsea, you've got 2 older brothers, you go to shul, you have dinner every Friday night. What are some of the other things you would do as a child?
Well, instead of going to Hebrew school, which I really wanted to go to Hebrew school, my parents sent me to Yiddish school. They just felt that Hebrew was not the language to learn. So they wanted me to learn Yiddish so that I could converse with my grandparents. And I really had a good time in Yiddish school, and that's where I learned actually to read. It's the same alphabet as Hebrew, so I learned to read Hebrew at that time also, besides Yiddish.
What is there, a neighborhood Yiddish school?
Yes, there was.
So a lot of the families, what percentage of Chelsea at that time was Jewish?
I would say 90%. There was a synagogue on every corner. There was, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the schools were closed because nobody would go. You know, we were all Jewish.
So you grew up in Chelsea with Jews surrounding you. You go to, what year did the Safon family get a color TV set?
When I was in the 8th grade, was the first time we got a television set.
So it must have been about 1947?
47, 48, yes. All my friends had TVs and I didn't. And so I would complain. And they said, well, the only place we can put it is in your bedroom. And I said, oh, that's fine. So they put the TV in my bedroom. And then I never got to go to sleep because everybody was sitting in my room watching Jerry Lester on the television. He would be on at 11 o'clock, or Ed Sullivan's show. And we finally got the TV at that point. My brother was in medical school, so he had to study in another room. And
how many rooms was your house?
We had 2 bedrooms and a big dining room that was my parents' bedroom. We had a living room and a kitchen and a bathroom. 1 bathroom.
1 bathroom. And so you had your own room?
I had my own room because I was the only girl.
So this was 1947. You get color TV.
We were living at that time on Bellingham Street.
Bellingham Street, and then what was the name of your junior high school?
I went to Shirtliff School, and it went from kindergarten to 9th grade.
And then in
And then
10th
Chelsea
grade?
High. I went to Chelsea High School.
And And what kind of activities did you participate at Chelsea High School?
I learned to play the saxophone because my brother Lenny played the clarinet, and we already had and the saxophone, so we already had the saxophone. So I played the saxophone in the band, and then I became a drum majorette and led the band. Um, we marched in parades, and my best recollection of being the drum majorette, the leading drum majorette, we got new uniforms, and we were doing a routine on the stage in front of the whole high school and parents and grandparents. And I was bending backwards, and my boot, my white majorette boot, got stuck in the hem of the skirt, and that was gold. And when I stood up to turn to stop the band, the hem was down in the back, and the audience burst out laughing. And so I turned around and bowed because I felt what happened. When I got off the stage, one of the boys said to me, "Marilyn, you really embarrassed me." Well, little to say that I yelled at him, of course. But I really loved being a drum majorette. I twirled the baton and I led the band in many parades.
And who was your first boyfriend?
Oh, who was my first boyfriend? I can't remember. I know I went to the prom in high school with Burton Scudney, who is since deceased. And and we had a sorority that I was the president of, Kappa Alpha Tau, the Cats.
Uh-huh.
And I was the president, and Burton's sister was a member, so we went to the prom together. And then I started to go out with a guy named Harvey Kasser, who is now a pharmacist in California. That was all in high school and the first year of college.
So you graduated high school, what, in the year
1952.
1952, and then you head out to Salem?
Yes, I was a Salem witch.
What made you choose Salem?
Well, first of all, at that time, it was a state school, and the tuition was $75 a year, and it was a teacher's college, and I desperately wanted to be a teacher. All my life I wanted to be a teacher. So I went out there, and I used to take the train. I never lived at school because we couldn't afford it, but I did take the train every day to Salem, and I did very well in college. In fact, when I graduated, I went back to my high school, to my algebra teacher, who told me I should never go to college because I wasn't good in algebra. And I showed him my diploma. So he said, "I guess you called me wrong."
So the train went all the way from Chelsea to Salem?
Yes, it was a real train.
Wow.
A choo-choo train.
Do you remember how much the tuition was at Salem?
Yes, $75 a year.
$75 a year.
And my brother Kenny paid for half of it. When he was working he was graduated already, and he was working and was able to pay half of my tuition because my parents just could not afford it.
Who paid the other half?
They did, my parents.
And so...
And I worked while I was in college. I worked at the learner shops in Boston. So when I'd come home, I then would take the subway to Boston and worked as a sales girl.
So you spent all day in Salem, came home, then took the train into Boston to work, and then you'd come home.
Yes.
How many hours a week would you work?
I probably worked about 30.
30 hours
Because
a week?
I worked all day on Saturday.
Okay. And so this was 1952...
53.
To 1956 maybe?
Yes, I did work every year.
So, along about this time, are you dating anybody in college?
I was dating several people. Harvey Kasser was one of them, and I can't remember any of the others. Um, but around my sophomore year, my friend Marilyn introduced me to Charlie Epstein.
Marilyn who?
Marilyn Julian. And
How did you know her?
well, she was in my class, and she lived in Everett, which is the next town to Chelsea.
And what was, so you were introduced to a young fellow named Charlie Epstein.
We called him Pinky.
Pinky, and so what was he doing at the time?
He was in the Marines, and he had just come back from Korea. And so we went to they called it a weenie roast, you know, where you'd cook hot dogs on the beach, and we had a really nice time. And then we went to the movies another night, and we saw Caine Mutiny. I'll always remember that. And we started dating seriously.
So your first date ever was at a weenie roast?
With my.
And that was a blind date, or
That was a blind. Well, yes, that was
date?
a blind date.
A blind date, and then you hit it off and went to see a movie, and then started. When did you date exclusively?
Probably about a month later.
So this was in the year what? 19 what?
1953 or 54, around there.
So you dated, okay. So you're still finishing college.
Yes.
He's in the Marines. He's out of the Marines.
He's out of the Marines at
Doing
that point.
what?
He started to go to Boston State Teachers College.
Okay. So he's at Boston, both studying to be a teacher. Now, is he behind you in school? Since
Yes.
So you graduated first?
Yes, I graduated 2 years ahead of him because he was in the Marines.
So you graduated in the year 1956. So how did he ask you to marry him?
Well, he kept telling me he loved me, and he just said, you know, we have to get married. And I said, okay.
Now, what do you remember the date that he asked you to marry him?
No, that I don't remember.
But what year was it?
1954.
54, so you had a long engagement.
Yes,
you
we
didn't get
did.
married until 1956.
We got married the week after I graduated college.
So you waited, were engaged for 2 years.
Yes.
Before you got married.
Yes.
So where was the wedding?
The wedding was in Malden, Massachusetts, at the synagogue, B'nai Israel. And it was on a Sunday evening, the week after my graduation. And it was a beautiful wedding. And my best friend Selma was the maid of honor.
You were 21 years old.
I was. And my sister-in-law Jeannie was my matron of honor. And that's all that I had.
Now Lenny was married to Jean.
To Jeannie.
Was Kenny married to Barbara yet?
No, he got married in 1958.
So, okay. So you got married, and where did you go on your honeymoon?
We went to Shawanga Lodge in the Catskill Mountains. We went for a week, and we had a great time. It was fun there. We swam and we played tennis, and we did it. We won all kinds of prizes.
Do you remember what size your wedding dress was?
Yes, I do. It was a size 10, and it had to be taken in. Oh, there's a story behind the wedding dress. My future brother-in-law, Howie Edwards, that was Charlie's older brother. He worked at a store in Boston. He was the manager, and they were having a wedding dress sale. So he called me and he said, Marilyn, you should come in and try on a wedding dress. So I did, and I found the one that I loved so much, and I only had to pay $25 for it. And I sold it for $100 after the wedding.
So let's backtrack a little bit, because you just mentioned Howie.
Yes.
Let's go to, now you met Charlie in 1953, 54, somewhere in there. Let's talk about
Charlie's family.
David and Catherine Epstein.
Okay. David and Catherine were Charlie's parents, and David worked in Boston in a men's clothing store, and Catherine did not work, but she had a beautiful singing voice, and so she was able to volunteer or sing in the opera in Boston. And
I thought vaudeville.
she was in vaudeville before that, but she did sing in the opera in Boston.
And so what about David and Catherine's parents? When did they come over?
I don't know anything about David's parents, but Catherine's father came over from Holland, and he was the first diamond cutter for Tiffany's in New York. And he came over from Amsterdam and lived with, after his wife died, he lived with Dave and Catherine in their home until the day he died. He was over 100 years old when he died. Oh, and his name was David Springer.
David Springer. Now so he came over, we don't know when he came over to America?
No, that I don't know.
Was Catherine born in America?
Catherine was born in America, in New York, and so was Dave. He was born in New York on Houston Street, spelled like Houston.
Okay, so 1956 comes around, you get married, you're on the honeymoon, you get back from a honeymoon, and does Charlie still have a couple years left of school?
Yes, he did.
So did you get a job right away?
I had a job right away in Bedford, Massachusetts, and at that time, it was one of the highest paying teaching jobs. It was $3,200 a year. And we got an apartment in Belmont, Massachusetts, and we both taught at the temple in Belmont at Temple Bethel, and we had a car that one of Charlie's aunts had given us. It was a Henry J, which is, it was a little small car, and it had no floor, a holy floor, so if you'd go over a bump and there was water, you'd have to lift your feet because they'd get wet otherwise. But we had that little car, and Charlie took the bus into Boston to go to school, and then when he graduated, he got a job in where did he work? Somewhere in South Massachusetts. So we each went, I went north and he would go south. And he taught 6th grade at that time, and I taught 3rd.
So a few years later, in 1960, something happened.
Yes, we had our first child. Her name is Corey Lee. It's now Sarek. She was Corey Lee Epstein, and we would ask her name, and she'd say Corey, and we'd say Lee. And so she'd say Corey Lee. So she always thought her name was Corey Lee.
And so
she was born on August 29th, 1960.
Okay.
But we lived in Watertown at that time. We moved to an apartment in Watertown, Massachusetts.
And how long did you live there before you moved to Bedford?
We lived there probably 4 years.
So John was also born and brought home to Watertown?
No, he was, I don't think so. I think he was brought home to Bedford.
Okay. And so June 1963, your 7th anniversary, on the dot.
On the dot.
Comes
Jonathan Allen Epstein. And when Jonathan was born, the photographer in the hospital said, "This baby looks just like Dr. Safon." That was my brother. And he took the picture of him, and he put glasses and a stethoscope. He did not know that it was Lenny's nephew. And he brought the picture up to me. He said, "You know, your son's going to be a doctor someday." And I said, "Well, he looks just like my brother." Oh, he put hair on. He drew hair on him too. So when he was a baby, he looked just like Uncle Lenny.
So this time, where are you both working when John was born in 1963?
Well, I was still working in Bedford, and Charlie was working in Lowell, Massachusetts. He was the director of Model Cities at that time.
And what is Model Cities?
Model Cities is a program that was a government program to build up um, the ghettos in big cities. And his was in Lowell, Massachusetts. And they were building up schools and building homes, and it was really a good program. But one summer, it was President Nixon at the time, and he cut all the funding for that program. But Charlie kept working at it, and we got no pay that summer, except what I was making at camp, day camp. So we ate a lot of spaghetti.
So Corey, 1960, John, 1963, and then something magical happened in 1966.
Oh, of course. My baby was born. His name was Richard Eric Epstein. He was born on July 9th, 1966. What a beautiful baby. And I have to say it because he's interviewing me. But he was a joy, and we all had a wonderful family. We had 2 boys, a girl and 2 boys.
And you're very involved with a fantastic recreation group, the Bedford Minutemen. Tell us about that.
Well, all of the county had, each small town would have a group called the Minutemen that would be remembering the history of the Revolutionary War.
Reenactment groups.
Well, they were reenactment, but they did other things too. And Charlie had a uniform, and I had a couple of ball gowns, and we were very active. Charlie became the captain, and he would lead the parades. And we had strawberry festivals on the 4th of July. Oh, and when Rick was born, that summer we had the strawberry festival on the 4th of July, and I was very pregnant. And they wanted me to sit on the cannon so that Rick would be born on the 4th of July, but he wasn't born on the 4th of July. He waited till the 9th. And we had a wonderful time with the Minutemen. We made very close friends.
How many people were involved in that organization?
They had about 60 men who were Minutemen, and then, of course, their whole family. My boys, instead of playing Cowboys and Indians, they would play Redcoats and Minutemen. And we would go to reenactments. And when Rick was just a little baby, we went to White Plains, New York, and Rick was in his carriage, and he slept during the whole battle. All the shooting and the cannons, and he slept. We all laughed.
So, Bedford, Massachusetts, what was the address of the house at Bedford?
It was on 242 Carlisle Road. It was on the same street as the dump. And we would go to the dump, and it was a social event. You'd find all kinds of stuff there.
And in 1970, Charlie gets a new job.
Yes.
And where do you go?
We move up to Manchester, New Hampshire, on 1367 Chestnut Street. And I couldn't understand. The house was lovely, and the living room was in the back of the house with a huge picture window. I couldn't understand why was the picture window in the back of the house. Well, I soon realized that in the winter, we were on the bottom of a hill, and people would ski down the hill or coast on their sleds. In the spring or the fall, the trees looked like you painted them. It was so beautiful. And we just loved living in Manchester. It was a great town. And talk about politics, that's where the first primary was held. And it was held at the JCC. We would have a lot of people sleeping over, and they would come to the JCC where Charlie was director. And we were very involved with the first primary those years.
And so, one of the memories I have is always the Sunday Sunday night dinner at Cafe Island.
Yes.
What are some of the other restaurants in Manchester that you would like?
Well, we would eat at Freddy's, not barbecue, Freddy's, like a smorgasbord buffet, Freddy's buffet. We would eat at Cora's bat mitzvah party was at a very nice Greek
Something
restaurant.
88.
Yes, Club 88,
Club
you're right.
88.
You remember better than I did. And it was a Greek restaurant, and we had a good time there. And we were very active in the synagogue there, Temple Shalom. And it was a nice place to bring up children. The kids went to school and in Webster Elementary School, and they'd walk through the woods. In those days, you let your children go through the woods, and they would walk to school. And Rick was very good friends with a guy named Adam Sandler, who has become very popular these days and very wealthy. He's a comedian. But Rick was funnier than Adam in school. However, Rick didn't become a comedian, but Adam did.
So in 1975, how did the whole business with Charlie, how did the whole business with Charlie getting the job in Austin, Texas, how did that start?
At that point, he decided that he should look for a different job because Manchester was not growing as far as the Jewish community, and he thought he should be making more money. So he applied to several places, and he interviewed in Florida and in Washington, and he finally got the job in Austin, Texas. He was the first professional federation director, and he did a really good job there. So we all moved to Austin, and we had a Volkswagen minibus. It was a 1970, and we got into that van, and we put our cactus garden on top on the roof, and we moved to Austin. We brought coals to Newcastle with our cactus, but we bought a house in Austin on Havenwood Drive, and a lovely home, and we settled in Austin, Texas.
And he was the executive director of the Jewish Federation of Austin, Community Council of Austin at that point.
Jewish Community Council, right.
And you did not have a job yet, so
No.
you became a substitute teacher.
Right.
And you wound up spending most of your time at what school?
At the Rosedale Elementary School. And at that point, the principal thought I was doing such a good job, she hired me, and I became the Title I reading teacher and the English as a second language. And when I'd have the children coming in from other countries and I was teaching them English, they learned with my Boston accent. And so they'd go back to their Texas teacher, and the teacher would say, you must have Epstein as a teacher, because they would all speak with my accent.
And so this was 1975 to 1980.
Correct.
In 1980, Charlie had to leave Austin.
Well, he got a job in Trenton, New Jersey as the executive director, and I happened to